Week 13 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few defense DST units I would start this week. The first one, Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So last week, they were a streaming option, and they rose to the occasion with a nice fantasy day, was Tampa Bay. So their defense getting a little bit healthier after the bye week in Week 11, and we saw them go out there at the Giants and take care of business. Like I said, Week 9 at Kansas City, 30 points allowed, 4 sacks, a fumble recovery. Week 10 versus San Francisco, 23 points allowed, 3 sacks, a fumble recovery. In Week 12 at the Giants, 7 points allowed, 4 sacks, a fumble recovery. So this week, another good matchup on paper at the Carolina Panthers. Give up the 8th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. Even though last week Carolina, they gave Kansas City obviously a run for their money, one of the best defenses in the league, and put up 27 points in that ballgame. Tampa Bay right now, they're healthy. They've looked better over the last couple weeks here. And I think this week in Carolina, their defense actually could have a better performance than Kansas City, because this is a division game. The division games, it's a whole different aspect than, a team like the Kansas City Chiefs from another division and conference coming over at Carolina and taking them easy. So this week in the division matchup, I think Tampa Bay goes out there. They don't underestimate Carolina, and their DST has a decent ballgame. The next start is the Denver Broncos. So Denver, they're pretty much locked in weekly, obviously, as a start, unless they're versing like a Kansas City or a high-powered offense like the Lions, something along those lines. So Denver this week, another great matchup after they took care of business last week. So this week versus the Cleveland Browns, give up the 4th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. In the last few weeks for Denver, Week 10 at Kansas City, 16 points allowed, 4 sacks. Week 11 versus Atlanta, 6 points allowed, 4 sacks and INT. And Week 12 at Vegas, it was surprising the Raiders even scored 19 points in that game. 5 sacks, an interception, and a fumble recovery. So this week, Denver back home, where their defense really does damage at home than it does on the road. And they get to the quarterback, and when you have one of the best corners, if not the best corner, where I believe he is, Patrick Surtain, the best corner in all pro football, makes everything easier, makes the pass rush get to the quarterback. If you can lock down a number 1 wide receiver and the quarterback can't lock in on his number 1 option. So this week versus Cleveland and Jameis Winston, who we know he's a boom or bust type of quarterback, where he'll get those big plays and touchdowns, and then also he'll give it back with interceptions and taking big hits. So this week on Monday night, I think Denver has another great performance. And like I said, Jameis Winston, the way he plays quarterback, will play right into their hands this week. The next start, the Indianapolis Colts. So this Colt team, a 1-week streaming option. I know the numbers all season long have been pretty bad for this DST, but this week it's a good matchup at the Patriots. I give up the 9th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So I know Drake May, he's been pretty decent since he came in at quarterback, but he's turning the football over, and defenses had some decent games of late, especially even with May in there, of putting up fantasy points. So Week 10 versus Buffalo, 24 points allowed, 2 sacks, 2 interceptions. Week 11 at the Jets, 27 points allowed, 3 sacks. And Week 12 versus the high-powered Lion offense, it was surprised Detroit only scored 24 points in that game and 3 sacks, even though they were up early and often, and they played with the clock in the second half. So this week, I think Indianapolis is a streaming option with a good matchup at the Patriots, could help fantasy owners, and I have them as a start this week. The next start, the Kansas City Chiefs. I know Kansas City, they're coming off a horrible ball game, in a game where their defense should have went out there and dominated at Carolina. And I know even the last couple weeks, their DST has taken a hit numbers-wise. Week 10 versus Denver, 14 points allowed, 2 sacks, and the game-winning block kick. Week 11 at Buffalo, 30 points allowed, an interception. And then last week, just no excuses at Carolina. They couldn't take care of business, and they needed to win on a last-second field goal. 27 points allowed and 2 sacks. So this week, Black Friday, Kansas City back home. Great matchup versus the Vegas Raiders, division rival that give up the 2nd most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. Aiden O'Connell is going to come back to the lineup. I think it's going to be a mess for this offense, and I think Kansas City could redeem themselves after a few weeks in a row where their defense hasn't played good football, and have a good showing versus the Vegas Raiders. And the 5th and final defense DST I would start is the Dallas Cowboys. So a streaming option, 1-week use only. Another division game here with the New York Giants coming to town Thanksgiving. And Dallas last week went out there and they definitely put up fantasy points, but obviously their special teams got the majority of the points for them. So the last few weeks, Week 10 versus the Eagles, 34 points allowed, 5 sacks, an interception, a fumble recovery. Week 11 versus Houston, they got the doors blown off, 28 points allowed, a sack, and interception. And then Week 12 at the Commanders, like I said, the special teams did big work for this Cowboy DST. 26 points allowed, 4 sacks, 2 interceptions, a 99-yard return touchdown for Keontae Turpin, and then an onside kick return touchdown with 20 seconds left and a fumble recovery. So those 2 return touchdowns obviously amounted to 12 fantasy points for the Dallas Cowboys. But this week with the Giants coming to town, a team they've owned over the last 6-7 seasons is this Dallas Cowboy team. And with Tommy DeVito in their quarterback and the Giants giving up the 5th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season, I think Dallas is a 1-week streaming option. Could be a decent start. So that's a few defense DST units I would start for week 13 of the fantasy football season.